Since there are a couple new faces, I want to introduce myself and share a little bit about who I am and why I'm running for the state legislature. My name is Daniel Hernandez. I am your current state representative. So the district goes from the city of South Tucson all the way down to the border, including Davis-Monthan, Green Valley, Sahuarita, the Tucson airport area, and all of Santa Cruz County. For me, this is my 7th year in elected office. I started as a school board member in 2011 in a special election where, I don't know if you heard, because some of you are newer to the area, Sunnyside, the school board that I'm finishing my last year on right now, had a lot of problems when I got there. When I was elected to the school board, we had a superintendent who was making over $300,000 a year. We had a board who was giving jobs to their friends and their family, not because they were qualified, but because of the widespread nepotism and corruption that existed.
Yay!
Yay! So I stood up to the nepotism and corruption, which meant that after 2 years of trying to really advocate for the families and the people that lived in the community, they tried to remove me from office. My fellow board members started a recall effort against me. They needed 1,300 signatures to remove me from office. Thankfully, they got about 80 because the community knew that I was actually trying to advocate for transparency and accountability. So I turned around and I used the same tools that they were using against me against them. So I recalled 2 of my fellow board members in what was a successful attempt to retake the board, to bring some sanity back to the to the school district. And that's the kind of mentality that I brought to the legislature, that I'm not just willing to accept the world as it is, I want to change it, because I know that with just a little bit of hard work and with a little bit of money, we can change the legislature. This year, we are at a pivotal point in the state of Arizona's history. So before I get too in-depth in my speech, I want to tell you a little bit about me. I was born in Tucson. My sister is Alma Hernandez. Some of you have seen her in the paper recently. She's also running for the legislature. But when she was 3 years old and I was 5, we were jumping up and down on our beds, thinking it was funny. She drop kicked me. I fell backwards and hit the back of my head on a metal filing cabinet that was next to the bed. We won't talk about how dangerous it is to have a metal filing cabinet with sharp edges near kids, but my head starts bleeding. My sister starts screaming. My mom comes in and says, "We need to go to the hospital." And if you can remember being 5 years old, being at the hospital was not something that was common, for me at least. And the only time I'd ever been was to visit sick or dying family members. So when my mom came in and said, "We're going to go to the hospital," for me, the scary thing where I'm bleeding turned into I'm dying. So my mom puts a towel around my head and we get in a taxi and we start headed to the nearest hospital, which at the time was St. Mary's. Before we left, she calls the hospital and says, "My son's head is falling off," making it seem as though I were basically decapitated. But because she's a mother and she's worried, she told the nurse. So when we got to the hospital, there was a nurse waiting outside for us. She sees us and she takes me into her arms and she says, "Sweetie, we're going to make everything okay." Take us inside, they clean me up, the doctor gives me 5 stitches, and he gave me $1 per stitch for being a brave boy. But he also told me, "Do you want to see what we do for a living?" Because he could tell that I was nervous because we were in the hospital. So he cleaned me up, and then he would tell his patients, "This is my assistant Daniel, is it okay if he comes in and listens to your heartbeat?" And it was that small moment and that small gesture of kindness that really changed the direction of my life. It was from that point on that I said I wanted to help people. So I trained as a nursing assistant, as a phlebotomist. In high school, I did 2 years of cancer research at the University of Arizona. I did 2 years working in a wet lab trying to find out if this kind of protein would inhibit tumor genesis. Super nerdy. By the time I was 10, I played my med school interview about 1,000,000 times. But in 2007, I realized it is not enough to just be the smart science kid. I need to have a diverse resume so that I can apply to med school and get in. So I said, okay, what can I do to diversify my resume and also to do something that's meaningful and important? And it was at that point that then Senator Clinton, announced that she was running for president, but she was announcing her run, and I said, "I've never worked on campaigns. This seems like a great opportunity. I get to do an internship, volunteer, gain some new experiences, but then when I apply to medical school, I'll have a diverse resume." I went in, my first campaign ended, and she didn't win. And I said, "I'm never working on campaigns ever again. This is the worst thing." I said, "If only I'd made a couple more calls as a 17 and at that point 18-year-old, And I said, I'm never doing this ever again. But thankfully, a lot of the people who I had worked with on the Hillary campaign, who jokingly referred to themselves as the Yentas for Hillary, drew me in to Gabby's campaign. And Gabby was very different than Hillary in a couple of different ways. One, I could see her. She was real. Where Hillary was a disembodied voice on the TV or on the radio, Gabby was a real person. And secondly, when she spoke, I could actually see in myself a lot of what she was talking about fighting to make sure that people who had pre-existing conditions had access to health care before the Affordable Care Act. So by the time the event ended, I had signed up and became an intern after saying I'm never working on a campaign ever again. And I was that precocious youngster that was always just around. And I became friendly with Gabby, and for the first time ever, I had somebody who challenged me. She asked me, well, why do you want to be a nurse or a doctor? Because from the time I was 5, when I had that incident at the hospital, I had said I wanted to go into healthcare to help other people. She pushed back and said, well, why? And it made me think, and it made me realize for the first time ever, that my real goal wasn't just to be a doctor for the sake of being a doctor, it was because I wanted to help people. So that has been my guiding influence for the last 10 years of working in public policy and in advocacy. Because of Gabby pushing me, I started with an organization called the Arizona Students Association. I passed my first law that I wrote when I was 20. I became a campaign manager for Steve Farley, who's now running for governor, a couple months later. And then now, I'm here as your state representative. So there's a little bit of a gap that I'll fill in, but I want to talk about my work in the legislature and why I'm running for re-election. So as a Democrat, especially one who's openly gay, who's the youngest member of the legislature, and who's Latino, there are a lot of inherent barriers to being successful. I don't come in with a lot of power. The power that I have is gained by working hard, by building relationships, but also by sticking to our core values as progressives and as Democrats. So for me, when I came in, the first bill that I introduced, I said, I'm going to spend the first year just getting to know my colleagues. Wow. So I spent a year getting to know my colleagues, and I introduced one bill to exempt feminine hygiene products, diapers, baby formula, and geriatric incontinence supplies from sales taxes, because these are not luxury items. These are all basic necessities to have a high quality of life. So that passed with wide bipartisan support. Didn't get all the way to the floor, but it taught me an important lesson about making sure that I had all my ducks in a row and a backup plan. And this year, one of the things that I was very proud to do, and Carolyn talked a little bit about this bill, I had a constituent come to me and say that there was this problem where people who were sexual assault survivors had accidentally been left out of a protection that was put in place 11 years ago. The Coalition to Domestic and Sexual Violence had created a new protection for domestic violence survivors, but because of a drafting error, it had been left out for sexual assault survivors. So for 11 years, there had not been the same protection for those who'd been sexually assaulted. And I said, okay, this is going to be a tough one, but I promise that I will do everything in my power to get this done. I immediately go with the most conservative woman I could find in the legislature. She is just someone who is as polar opposite as you can get of me. But I said, we found one thing that we can work on. Would you be willing to work with me? I'm even willing to let you carry it, have it in your name, because I don't care about getting credit. I care about getting this done. Her response is, let's give you a win. You know, Republicans get wins all the time. I want you to get a win. Generally, that doesn't happen as a freshman Democrat. So she works with me. We got 10 Republican co-sponsors across the ideological spectrum, from the most conservative rural Republicans to some of the folks that are more moderates in their caucus. If you can still call that being a moderate, because I think really there's no moderates left in the Arizona legislature. So we got 10 Republicans. I got 6 Democrats. We introduced the bill. It passed unanimously in the Judiciary Committee, passed unanimously in the House, and then it gets to the Senate and it dies. Because the chair of the Senate committee, who's now running for Congress, didn't bother to read the bill. And he said, well, there's going to be a lot of false reports, and there's going to be a lot of innocent men who are going to be accused of this, so I'm worried about those people being accused of sexual assault who aren't doing it. He said, well, if you'd read the bill, very bottom, right here, there's already something to protect those who are accused falsely. I said, oh, okay. So then I worked with him. We found another bill that was germane and amended it to that bill. So now it's an amendment on another bill. We're getting it through. It passes the Senate. Now it has to come back to the House, pass it in the House, send it off to the governor, and he vetoes it. Because at that time, Governor Ducey had said that he was not going to be signing any bills until the Bread for Ed plan, the 20 by 2020 plan that he had put together was passed. So our bill got caught up in that. So he passes his budget, he passes the 20 by 2020 plan, and then I work once again with Republicans and now the governor's office to make sure that we revive that bill that had been vetoed. So when I say I'm tenacious, I'm not kidding. I have learned my lesson that you work hard, you have a plan, but you work across the aisle. And even though there are people who have told me that I'm going to hell, I tell them, well, until I get there, can we work together? But I've been a co-sponsor or worked behind the scenes on a lot of things. There are 10 bad bills that I'm working to stop. I don't know if you remember, but in the Arizona Daily Star a couple months ago, there was a big op-ed talking about the work that I was doing to stop this anti-abortion bill. This bill would require women to give a reason why they were having an abortion, and it would give you a menu of options, including I was coerced, I'm being forced to do this, or I'm being sex trafficked. So these were the kind of reasons that they were saying people were being forced into having an abortion. So the bill gets through committee. I fought it at the committee level. I worked with Planned Parenthood. I worked with NARAL. I worked with every stakeholder. And then it gets to the floor. And I kind of went off the reservation and did something people were a little nervous about. I said, let's do an amendment that says if we want to know what the outcomes for women actually are in terms of health, let's ask a question that says, I didn't have access to adequate and affordable birth control, and I also didn't have adequate sex education, and just see what happens. And so drop this amendment, and it's on the floor, and again, up until it's my turn to talk about my amendment, everything that the Republicans are saying is it's about women's health care, it's about making sure that they have adequate support, and that we as a state know what we need to do to make sure we're protecting women. Then I introduce my amendment, and the person who's opposing me says, well, Mr. Hernandez, this is not about women's health care. And I'm like, we got them to admit it. He says, your questions about birth control and sex ed, they're not healthcare issues. Those are pre-healthcare issues. And I'm like, what the heck does that mean? Yeah. So we were not able to stop the bill, but we were able to get them to admit that this was all opportunity to try and intimidate women from having access to constitutionally protected rights that they've had. When it came to another issue, the issue of gun violence, we had an awful gun bill that the governor introduced, and I sat down with the governor along with a small group of Democrats, and we were a part of the negotiations, and he said, you know, this is a good bill, it's better than nothing, and I said, no, this is not better than nothing. This is actually going to make it easier for people who shouldn't have access to firearms to have access to firearms. So sometimes it takes working across party lines. In no world does it make sense for me to take your gun away because you're a threat to yourself and to others, to give it to your family member and say, well, as long as you promise not to give them their gun back, you can keep it. And that's the kind of bill that the governor wanted to push. So I'm running again. The opponent that I beat in 2016 is running against me again, painting me as an untalented, unsophisticated, not able to get anything done. So for me, it's funny because here I am talking about examples of bipartisan things that I've been able to do. So for me, I'm here today to take questions.
Curious what your priorities for the future are, assuming you get reelected.
Assuming I get reelected, when I was elected in 2016, we had a meeting as a Democratic caucus, and I was asked, what is your number one priority as a newly elected Democrat? And I said, to get more Democrats into the legislature. And that sounds a little bit glib, but it's important because for us to be able to move forward anything in the progressive agenda, we need more of our friends up there. So I've worked to make sure that other Democrats who are running in competitive races have some of the lessons that we've learned. I've helped them in their primaries, I've helped them in their generals. But the other thing that I want to do in terms of policy, one, I want to revisit the work that I did on making sure we're protecting women's rights. So I worked for Planned Parenthood for 18 months. Reproductive rights and access to affordable and accessible birth control, I think, seems like a minor issue to most people, but we know the impact that it can have on so many people's lives. So women's health is, I think, one of my top priorities. Gun violence prevention is, I think, equally up there in terms of importance. We have 98 Americans that are dying each and every single day because of gun violence, and in Arizona, it's the 8th deadliest state in the country when it comes to gun violence. We have an F from the Giffords Law Center because of our high incidence of gun violence, homicide, and suicide. So I was just in Los Angeles for the National Council of State Legislators at a policy academy talking about gun violence prevention. So I want to take some of the things that I've been learning as a legislator and as a policymaker and see if we can get enough support to get them over the finish line, especially when it comes to suicide prevention, when it comes to making sure that we really talk about responsible gun ownership. So we're not trying to take people's guns away, but we're saying if you have them, make sure you lock them up, make sure that you have them stored away so that people who are mentally ill or kids or anybody who may have the suicidal ideation doesn't have the easy access to that firearm. There's a statistic that they talked about at this gathering of gun violence prevention legislators where Senator D'Alessandro and I were both at in LA, and they said if someone is considering suicide, it takes about 90 seconds that suicidal ideation happens. If they have a firearm, they are more likely in that 90 seconds, if they have easy access, to actually do it. If they don't have access to a firearm, they are less likely to do it overall, especially because of the different medications and the other things that it would take a longer time. Whereas the gun is a quick fix to their problem at the time. So working on suicide prevention, working on gun violence prevention, and additionally, I've been a school board member for 7 years. I've been on the front lines of making cuts year after year after year. We want to make sure that we're actually looking at how are we adequately funding our schools. So even though we've gotten this influx of new money, it meant that the taxpayers in Pima County and in Tucson Unified particularly now have a 9% increase on their property rates to fund the desegregation problem that is a statewide problem, not just one that should only impact one group of students or one group of families. So the governor gets away and says, I raised revenue for schools without raising taxes. Well, tell that to the people in Pima County and the taxpayers of TUSD. Secondly, it is not okay for us to say, we're going to just fund this one part of education. Pima Community College, which is one of the largest workforce development tools that we have in Pima County, still gets exactly $0 from the state of Arizona. When it comes to school buildings and capital, we are woefully underfunding the school facilities board, which means we can hire you new teachers. The problem is nobody wants to work for the crappy pay we're giving them. Also, we can't even keep the buildings open in some schools because they're in such poor condition that we're having to close them down. So education funding is not purely an issue of let's try and get away with giving a couple teachers 10% raises. It's about how do we actually fund it so that people want to go into the teaching field, want to stay in the teaching field, and that people don't look at teaching as something that is not a job, that's a full-time job. I have colleagues all the time in the legislature who say, well, teaching's a part-time job. They have 3 months off in the summer. They use all their money to buy boats. That was one of the quotes from the majority leader this last year. So I think, again, getting new people in the legislature is important, but making sure that people like myself don't lose because we take things for granted.
What is your view of the homeless situation in Tucson?
That's a difficult question, and I think as policymaker, it's one that we have to do a lot more work to really get serious to work with the state and local folks to try and provide not just housing, but wraparound services. One of the things that I've done as a lawmaker is go to a lot of trainings and conferences. I talked to a lot of people who are out in San Francisco that has one of the largest homeless problems in the country about some of the things that they're doing. And obviously we don't have the resources and the revenue that California or San Francisco have, but there's a lot of lessons to be learned. The number one lesson to be learned was creating not just temporary housing, but creating housing that has wraparound services. That includes healthcare, especially mental health care. What they noticed when they were doing these audits and these interviews is one of the main reasons why they had such a homeless problem because they had a high mental health problem.
Yeah.
So these are people who couldn't hold down a job even if they wanted to because they weren't receiving the treatment and the medication. So what would happen is they'd get temporary housing for a day or two, then end up right back on the streets because they couldn't remember where they were supposed to go. They couldn't remember what they needed to do to take care of themselves. So it's not just a homeless problem where we give somebody, a voucher to go to a hotel for a night. It's about how do we actually create the scaffolding and the support for those social services so that we can take the mental health problem and really address it. We also have a high incidence of veterans who live in Arizona because of our temperate climate who end up being homeless because it's a lot easier to be homeless and live under a bridge in Tucson than it is in, say, Massachusetts or somewhere else where it's really cold. So our temperate climate means that we get a lot of veterans who live here, who move here, and then potentially end up being homeless. So I've actually met multiple times with the Southern Arizona VA about how do we start making sure that we provide more resources. But it's something where we need to work together with the state, local, and county to make sure that we have all these wraparound services, because there are some things that the state can provide, there are some things that the feds can provide, and there are some things that the local folks can provide, particularly when it comes to facilities. So there are a lot of facilities that we could take and renovate, and instead of trying to turn it into a high-rise apartment building, try and provide some mixed use or low-income housing to help support those who are, like you mentioned, in need of housing, but also in need of job training, in need of mental health support and healthcare. There was a woman that I met who's a nurse at UMC who talked about a homeless person who came in who had been wearing a couple layers of socks and had worn them for so long that when they tried to clean them and tried to take them off, the skin was falling off with the sock because they'd worn them for so long.
Right.
And that happens because these people don't have access to things that many of us take for granted, including showers and laundry facilities. Yes.
You mentioned the veterans who are homeless in Tucson. A couple of years ago, didn't Jonathan Rothschild and the leadership all in Tucson start a program to house our homeless veterans?
Yes.
How did that go?
It's going really well.
I thought it was.
It's going really well, but it's still a problem, and that's where I think one group can't fix it alone, and that's the thing that I really want to emphasize. It's going to take the support of the state VA system, it's going to take the support of the federal and the local, so we all need to work together. But as I'm sure you've seen, the people in Phoenix have a tendency to see Tucson and Phoenix and say boo and try and make it harder for them to get things done. So whether it's a gun buyback program that Phoenix used to have, or whether it's the homeless problem that we're trying to address, the cities can't do it alone. But far too often, the legislature in Phoenix decides, you know what, let's punish these cities because we don't like what they're doing because they're too democratic or they're too progressive. So it's going well, but it needs additional support, and it needs support from the state because the city can't afford to fund it on its own.
Well, I'm glad to know that what it's doing, it's still doing, and it's doing well.
Right.